Silence. Every eye turned toward her. The girl who smiled, who brewed quietly in the background, who never said much beyond, "Would you like extra sugar?" She dipped her head slightly, but her voice stayed clear. "I think we could create a space where there are poetry readings, or where art students can hang their work. Maybe a corner where someone can sit, not order anything, just read. Or a little anonymous box for people to write down what they're carrying." She paused, her hand resting gently on the notebook. Maybe they'll come back, not for the coffee, but for that feeling. The feeling that it's okay to just be here. No one needing you to be happy or clever or impressive. Lucas said nothing, but something in his expression softened. Clara hadn't used business terms, no flowcharts, no market analysis, just fragments of emotion, raw, lived in, drawn from the quiet spaces she walked through every day. After the meeting, people filtered out. Clara tried to slip away, but Lucas came toward her. No grand gestures. "Clara." She turned. He wasn't smiling, but his head tilted slightly, as though listening for a breath. "I need someone who understands this place. Not from numbers, from the inside. Do you have time to work with me on this? I think we can start with what you just said." She blinked. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be you," Lucas replied. And finish the thought. "You didn't have time to finish this morning." Clara didn't know how to answer. She nodded, and barely, and something unfamiliar rose in her chest. Not exactly joy, and more like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind curling around her, and someone reaching out a hand. That night, she came home late. Her mother was already asleep, the bedroom light dim. Clara set her bag on the worn kitchen table and pulled out the leather-bound notebook she hadn't touched in months. She opened to the first page. The pen hovered. Then she began to write, ideas for a space that feels alive, tied to people, unforced, no, brand needed. The words appeared like breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes were bright. Not because she knew she'd succeed, but because for the first time she felt needed. Not to pour coffee, but to say something no one else could say. Belief doesn't arrive like lightning. It blooms like lavender, slow, gentle, and by the time you notice, it's already there. Clara had spoken, not to be heard, but because something inside her finally refused to stay quiet. And you, have you ever had a moment where you had to speak up, even while your heart trembled? Share it in the comments, and stay close because soon, Clara will have to stand in the light of every eye in the room, with only her voice and one reason strong enough not to look away. The sky had yet to fully lighten when Clara stepped out of her small apartment at the end of a street lined with elms, their branches bare and brittle in the cold. Denver's sky was sheathed in a wet, grey hush. The rain didn't fall in, drops but hung in the air like a breath, so fine it only made itself known when it gathered on a sleeve. She walked, bag slung over one shoulder, clutching a worn scarf embroidered with faded words, warm hands, kind heart. Her mother had knitted. The winter she began chemotherapy. Clara had never once forgotten it, even though that winter had passed nearly 3 times over now. The café sat quietly on a corner, no blaring music, no neon signs. Just an old glass window with warm light spilling through like a whispered invitation. Inside, Clara flicked on the lights, wiped down each table with care, straightened the sugar jars, and placed a small vase on the wooden counter. In it, a few dried sprigs of lavender. She didn't have to do that. No one had taught her to decorate with flowers, but Clara believed scent was the first thing that held onto a person's mind, something that could soften even the worst kind of morning. The bell above the door chimed as she stood behind the counter, her earth-toned apron marked with yesterday's espresso. A man stepped in. Brown hair, charcoal wool coat, eyes sharp but dulled by fatigue. Clara guessed. Business? The kind who wandered into a cafe only because it was close to a meeting. "Good morning," he said. His voice was like a piano key pressed between 2 notes, clear but not quite decisive. Clara nodded. "Hi. What can I get for you?" "Just coffee. Black. No sugar." He didn't look at her when he said it. She tapped it into the register, already storing it in memory. Black, no sugar. But as she turned away, she paused for a breath. Something in the man's eyes, even just in passing, stirred a strange familiarity, like a face glimpsed in an old dream. When the coffee was set down, the name Lucas peeked out from the folder on the table as he reached for his laptop, but his sleeve caught the cup's edge. The dark liquid spilled in a wide arc across his crisp white shirt, blooming into a stain like a crushed moth. "Shit," he muttered, jerking back his chair. Clara said nothing. She moved quickly, so swiftly her footsteps made no sound. A moment later, she returned with a clean cloth, a few ice cubes wrapped in soft cotton, and a small bottle of white vinegar, the same tools she used to clean her mother's clothes. After a tremor sent soup flying from a spoon. "Hold still," she said quietly, kneeling beside the table. Lucas opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. She didn't look at him, just bent forward, dabbing the stain with measured care. Her hands were steady, though he was close enough to feel her breath. A hush settled around her, a kind of quiet that slowed everything down, each movement deliberate, precise. Lucas watched her like a puzzle he couldn't solve, this small woman in a forgotten corner of the city, saving something he'd already given up on. Not because she had to, but because it was simply the right thing to do. "Done," Clara murmured. "You'll want to dab it again later." He nodded, a beat slower than before. When their eyes met as she stood, he saw something deeper than gratitude, the quiet of someone used to enduring, but not embittered by it. "Let me remake your coffee," she said. "Stronger blend. You look like you need it." Lucas let out a faint laugh, his first that day. She turned away, and in that small, unremarkable gesture, he realized this wasn't just another barista. This was someone who knew a cup of coffee could be more than caffeine. It could say, "I see you," even when you don't say a word. She placed the fresh cup in front of him, the aroma darker, the finish lingering. He took a sip. His heartbeat slowed, not because of the caffeine, but because of the way everything here was held together, like someone believed even the smallest things deserved attention. "Thanks," he said, eyes lingering on her face a moment longer. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. When Lucas stepped outside, the rain was still falling, barely. He paused by the window, longer than he meant to. Through the blurred glass, he saw Clara leaning over, tidying the days. Newspapers. He couldn't say why, but he felt the tug to return, not for the coffee, for her, for the strange and quiet pull of someone who made you feel, even without asking, that it was okay to stay. Rumors began the way rain often does, not with thunder but with a strange suspended silence in the air. Clara heard it from Amy, the afternoon waitress, while slicing banana bread the next morning. "The owner's looking for investors," Amy whispered, as though speaking it aloud might make the news more real. "If no one puts up money, the cafe will close before Christmas." Clara paused, knife resting on the cutting board. For a few seconds there was no sound but the wind hissing faintly beyond the window panes. The cafe, its wooden sign etched with marrow and mirth, wasn't just a workplace. It was a second home, a second heartbeat she carried beyond. The apartment with the oxygen machine's soft pulse. "Where's the owner?" Clara asked quietly. Amy shrugged. "Said he had a private meeting this morning with a potential investor. Anyone who wants to stay and listen can." Clara hadn't planned to. She preferred to stay invisible, and meetings like these always made her feel smaller than usual. But today her hands didn't reach for her apron strings. Something held her in place. Not curiosity. Something closer to intuition. At 10, the tables were cleared in the back. A few employees lingered, notebooks in hand for show. Clara slipped into a seat in the last row, quiet, her gaze low. A smear of flour still clung to her fingers. The back door opened. The owner's voice came first. "Thanks for staying. I'd like to introduce Lucas Bell, our potential investor." Clara looked up. The room, though small, seemed to stretch taut with something unspeakable. A name might mean nothing, but a face can't be mistaken. Lucas, the man in the coffee-stained white shirt from the morning before, the one with the eyes that seemed to assess every space before stepping into it, stood less than 2 meters away. Wore a suit today. Not flashy, the kind tailored so precisely it made you forget he was dressed up at all. A pale blue shirt, no tie, but his eyes hadn't changed. Still sharp, still knowing. Lucas surveyed the room, smiling only faintly. His voice was low, clipped. "I'm not here to change everything. I just want to know if this place deserves to keep living." It wasn't a threat, but it dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The owner laid out the numbers: profits down, rent up, foot traffic thinning. Lucas said nothing. He didn't take notes or nod along. He just looked. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately from one person to the next, as though weighing which of them still believed in this place. When his eyes landed on Clara, they stayed. A moment longer than they should have. She felt it not just in the glance, but in her own heartbeat, quick then faltering. She didn't know what to do. Looking away felt rude. Meeting his gaze felt too intimate. She chose to look down, as if reviewing her notes, but her fingers clenched the corner of her notebook and her lips trembled slightly. After the meeting, people drifted off. Lucas remained a moment, speaking softly with the owner. Clara retreated behind the counter, fussing with cups and dishes. Though her movements were clumsy, off rhythm, she didn't know why she felt seen. Not in the usual sense. Seen as if that man, the one who could sign away this cafe's future, had glimpsed something in her she hadn't even noticed herself. Lucas passed the counter on his way out. He paused for exactly 1 second. He didn't speak, just looked at her and those same eyes and smiled softly. Barely there. Clara looked up just as he turned away. And in that flicker of a moment, she felt something she'd never let herself believe. Maybe. She wasn't invisible. As the door clicked shut, Clara stood still. The wind stirred the pot of dried lavender on the counter. She watched his silhouette disappear beyond the window. Her hand remained on the table. Her heart still thudded. Fast, and for the first time in months she didn't know if it was from worry or the beginning of something else entirely. Team meetings were never something Clara looked forward to. That morning, when the cafe owner messaged the staff inviting them to a strategy session with the investor, she'd almost declined, partly because of her shift schedule, but mostly because she didn't believe she had anything to offer. Clara had always stayed in the background, not because she didn't understand things, but because she never thought what she had to say mattered. Her strengths lived in her hands, brewing coffee, polishing glass, aligning chairs just so. Words. She'd always assumed they belonged to someone else. But for some reason, maybe it was Lucas's eyes the day before, or the quiet dread that if she stayed silent, this place might truly disappear. She showed up. The makeshift meeting room had been set up in the back corner of the cafe, where acoustic nights used to echo once in a while. Wooden chairs arranged in a circle. Clara chose the one nearest. The fire exit, out of the way but close enough to hear every word. Lucas arrived a few minutes late. He was dressed simply, olive shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, but his gaze was the same, calm, perceptive, and every so often brushing against Clara's in a way that made her look away too fast. The owner started things off, talking about the old model, what wasn't working anymore. "We need a new menu, promotions, a more modern vibe." A barista suggested adding trendy drinks from social media. Another proposed rebranding. New logo, better website, someone to run digital ads. Clara stayed silent, jotting notes. In her journal, though no one had asked. "We want to stand out, right?" Someone said. "Then we need to look the part. We need to feel modern." Lucas didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. He listened the way people sometimes pray and with their entire body. Another voice chimed in. "We should hang up celebrity photos. People love a bit of fame." That's when Clara looked up. Something inside her shifted, like the final drop before the glass spills. She didn't raise her hand. She just spoke, her voice steady enough that it stilled the room. "I think a cafe doesn't need to stand out to survive. It just needs to make people feel like they belong. Silence. Every eye turned toward her. The girl who smiled, who brewed quietly in the background, who never said much beyond, "Would you like extra sugar?" She dipped her head slightly, but her voice stayed clear. "I think we could create a space where there are poetry readings, or where art students can hang their work. Maybe a corner where someone can sit, not order anything, just read, or a little anonymous box for people to write down what they're carrying." She paused, her hand resting gently on the notebook. Maybe they'll come back, not for the coffee, but for that feeling, the feeling that it's okay to just be here, no one needing you to be happy or clever or impressive. Lucas said nothing, but something in his expression softened. Clara hadn't used business terms, no flowcharts, no market analysis, just fragments of emotion, raw, lived in, drawn from the quiet spaces she walked through every day. After the meeting, people filtered out. Clara tried to slip away, but Lucas came toward her. No grand gestures. "Clara." She turned. He wasn't smiling, but his head tilted slightly, as though listening for a breath. "I need someone who understands this place. Not from numbers, from the inside. Do you have time to work with me on this? I think we can start with what you just said." She blinked. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be you," Lucas replied. "And finish the thought. You didn't have time to finish this morning." Clara didn't know how to answer. She nodded unbarely, and something unfamiliar rose in her chest. Not exactly joy, more like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind curling around her, and someone reaching out a hand. That night, she came home late. Her mother was already asleep, the bedroom light dim. Clara set her bag on the worn kitchen table and pulled out the leather-bound notebook she hadn't touched in months. She opened to the first page. The pen hovered. Then she began to write. Ideas for a space that feels alive, tied to people. Unforced. No. Brand needed. The words appeared like breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes were bright. Not because she knew she'd succeed, but because for the first time she felt needed. Not to pour coffee, but to say something no one else could say. Belief doesn't arrive like lightning. It blooms like lavender, slow, gentle, and by the time you notice, it's already there. Clara had spoken, not to be heard, but because something inside her finally refused to stay quiet. And you? Have you ever had a moment where you had to speak up even while your heart trembled? Share it in the comments and stay close, because soon Clara will have to stand in the light of every eye in the room, with only her voice and one reason strong enough not to look away. Not everyone understands the power of a song played in the late hours of the day. Clara did. Not because she studied music or ever sang in front of a crowd, but because she had once watched her mother's eyes light up at the sound of a melody from an old radio. On days she couldn't sit up, couldn't speak, yet still managed to smile when the first notes of her favorite song floated into the room. Clara had learned that some things can't be healed by medicine. Some wounds can only be soothed by music, by memory, by the quiet endurance of beauty. That's why she proposed the first acoustic night. The idea had started as a scribbled note in her journal. Music. Every Friday. No stage. Just warm light, wooden chairs, and real people. She hadn't been sure Lucas would go for it, but when she handed him the draft plan, he only nodded. Let's try. But it has to feel like you. The day began with the scent of rain. Clara and Lucas arrived early. She brought strands of soft white bulb lights, the kind used at outdoor weddings. Lucas had a crate of old speakers he'd rescued from a vintage shop years ago. There was no crew, no event staff. Just the two of them, 2 pairs of hands, and the narrow patio behind the cafe, once used for storing old furniture. They strung lights from tree branches, stretched wires along the edge of the wooden awning. Lucas stood on a ladder while Clara held it steady, watching as he tested each plug. The first bulb lit just as the sky turned gold. Nothing fancy, not too bright, just enough to make the evening feel like a constellation had landed in their backyard. The sound system crackled slightly. Clara played a test song on her phone. An acoustic voice filtered through the speakers, low, gravelly, as if someone were telling a story after dinner. She looked at Lucas. He said nothing. But something in his face softened. "Do you think anyone will come?" she asked, her voice betraying a flicker of doubt. "They will," Lucas said without hesitation. She smiled, just a little. By nightfall, the wooden chairs filled the patio. On each table sat a glass jar with a flickering candle. Clara wore a fresh apron, her hair tied up. Lucas wore a light linen shirt, simple and unassuming. The first guests were an older couple. They ordered tea and said nothing. Then came small groups, students, neighbors, friends of the staff. A few street musicians showed up with guitars, harmonicas. One man carried a weathered violin. The music began without an announcement. A young man stood, guitar in hand, and said softly, "I wrote this one for my mother." Clara stood behind the counter, drying glasses as always. But when the chords began, bare, quiet, without embellishment, she stopped. The voice wasn't perfect, but something about it held the room still. Golden light, soft rain outside, and a voice that felt like a breath from the past. Clara bowed her head, polishing the rim of a glass. But her fingers paused at a single droplet sliding to the bottom. Not condensation, but a tear escaping her eye. Lucas saw. He stood near the entrance, never pushing forward. He saw the way her shoulders curved, the way her hand gripped. The counter, like she was holding something fragile, something almost too full to carry. He didn't speak, didn't move closer. Just stood quietly witnessing the quiet bloom of a soul learning how to breathe again. When the song ended, the applause was gentle, more exhale than ovation. Clara lifted her head. Her eyes shimmered, but her smile was steady. Lucas was still there. And he understood then. What pulled him wasn't just the concept or the cafe or even the music. It was her, the shy girl with neatly tied hair and hands always in motion, the one who had somehow created a space where people felt safe and seen. As the next melody drifted through the evening, Lucas knew he hadn't come here to invest in a coffee shop. He had come to rediscover something he'd lost long ago, the feeling of connection without explanation. The performance had long ended. Most of the guests were gone. Only a few unwashed cups remained, a few streaks of water on the tables, and the muted golden glow of string lights bleeding through misted windows. Outside, the rain had stopped. But it lingered in the air like a whisper that hadn't quite finished. Clara moved quietly, gathering crumpled drink coasters. Lucas was unhooking the lights, unscrewing each bulb, and laying them gently into a box. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They were wrapped in the hush that follows something beautiful, an after-stillness that felt almost sacred. On the wooden floor, the neon light cast long reflections. Each step echoed softly. The creak of boards, the hush of a broom, the familiar quiet of two people accustomed to solitude. Lucas sank into a wooden chair near the counter, no longer looking like an investor. His shirt was rumpled, sleeves pushed to his elbows. He watched Clara wiping down the counter, her eyes still red from the evening, her face composed. "You ever hear the saying, 'The quietest people see the most'?" he asked, his voice light, as if he wasn't really expecting an answer. Clara paused, not turning around. "No," she said, "but it sounds true." Lucas smiled faintly. He lowered his gaze, threading his fingers together. "I once slept in my car for a year." She turned this time. Her eyes widened, not from shock, but from something gentler. Curiosity, really. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He nodded, still looking down. "Quit my job, poured everything I had into my first project. It collapsed in 4 months. I lost everything, money, apartment. All I had left was a beat-up car and a few books. I parked near the public library, read by the headlights." Clara didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. She simply crossed the room and sat across from him, still holding the cleaning cloth like a talisman. Something small and safe. "There was a point I thought I'd never get back up again. And the worst part wasn't being broke. It was Starting to believe I didn't deserve to dream anymore? Clara looked down, her hand tightening slightly around the edge of the towel. I understand, she said after a long pause. Yeah. Lucas lifted his eyes to hers. I've never slept in a car, she said with a soft laugh that barely disguised the emotion behind it. But I live in a tiny house where the only person I care about is fading. A little more every day. Lucas didn't flinch. He met her gaze without pity, only presence. My mom has cancer, Clara continued. Stage 4 I work here to help pay her bills. Every morning I leave the house, I lock the door so gently it barely clicks. And every night when I come back, I'm afraid to open it. Afraid it'll be the day I lose her. She didn't. Cry. But her voice broke in places, like glass cracking beneath too much pressure. Quiet but unmistakably sharp. I've never dreamed bigger than a good cup of coffee, she said. Just hot enough, just smooth enough, just kind enough that someone might want to come back. I thought maybe that was enough. Lucas didn't answer right away. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The corners were worn, no title, no author's name, no pictures. Just a slim journal with frayed edges. I wrote this while living in my car, he said, offering it to her. It's for the people no one hears. Clara took it. She opened to the first page. In tiny print, it read, "This book is for those who quietly dream." A tear fell, sudden, silent, not out of sadness but recognition. The kind of tear that comes when someone for the first time reaches for your hand in the dark and finds it. Lucas didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, steady and still, knowing that in moments like these what we need most isn't advice. It's someone who stays. Rain seeped softly into the wooden walls. Two people sat across from each other, like mismatched notes in the same song, different in tone but exactly where they belonged. That night they didn't say anything more, and they didn't have to. The living room was dark, lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight in the corner, casting Clara's shadow in long, gentle waves across the ceiling. Her eyes were wide open, her fingers clenched tight around the edge of the bedsheet. Another sleepless night. The alarm clock read 2:13 a.m. Outside the window, a distant car horn rose and faded. Wind hissed faintly through the glass. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, but the image returned, clearer than ever. That meeting room, 20 pairs of eyes and her in the center, expected to speak. A day earlier, the cafe owner had made the announcement. "Clara, we'd like you to represent the team in the presentation to the associate investors. You understand this vision best." Her heart had dropped straight to the floor. She had wanted to refuse, had almost said no. But Lucas had looked at her, not with pressure, not with challenge, but with a quiet kind of faith. And that, more than anything, had made her stay. Since then, each night had been a battle. She rewrote her speech 10 times, deleted 9, practiced in the mirror. But her voice broke after a few lines. Clara wasn't afraid of failing. She was afraid of being seen, of being measured, of being found. Not enough. On the morning of the presentation, she arrived early, arms wrapped around a stack of printed notes. Her eyes were ringed with shadows. Her lip was raw from biting. She stepped into the meeting room and saw the upholstered chairs, the clip-on mics, the projection screen glowing behind the podium. Her chest tightened. The air was too thick. She stood in the middle of the room, her palms freezing. An hour before the meeting, Clara slipped out. She walked quickly down the hallway, all the way to the emergency stairwell. Her hand reached for the exit handle, clear intent. Run. Escape. But then a low voice called from behind. "Clara." She turned. Lucas stood there, calm, unhurried. He said nothing, just held out a small folded piece of paper. She opened it. In blue ink, handwritten, "The only failure is never showing up." Clara stared at the words. She didn't speak, but her fingers curled around the note, and instead of turning away, she turned back toward the room. Standing behind the microphone, she felt like she was dreaming. The stage lights burned hot on her face. Her heart pounded wildly. Her hands trembled, her mouth was dry. She opened the first slide. No one spoke, but the weight of their gaze sliced through her. "Good morning," she said, her voice hoarse. I'm Clara. I've worked at the cafe for 4 years, and I've never presented in front of anyone before." A few people chuckled softly. She bit her lip, then looked at her notes. But instead of reading line by line, she looked up, met their eyes. "I don't have a business degree. I'm not a designer. I don't know how to run ads, but I know why people come to our cafe." The room grew still. Some people come because they need a place to sit quietly, without being asked too many questions. Some come for the cappuccino, with the little heart the barista draws each morning. Some come every Tuesday, because their wife passed away on a Tuesday. She paused. Her heartbeat still thundered in her chest, but her voice was steadier now. "I don't have a beautiful reason to save this place, except that it's one of the few spaces left where people still feel seen." Silence stretched. No. One moved. Clara looked down at her hands, then up at the screen, where an image from the acoustic night filled the wall behind her. Smiling faces, warm lights, hands folded gently together. "We don't need a flashy place to call home. Just a small corner where strangers can sit beside each other and listen to a song in silence." She stopped there. No closing slide, no rehearsed finale. For a moment, the room remained completely still. No applause, no smiles. Then one person stood, then another. Applause followed, slow, rising like a tide. Someone nodded. Someone wiped away tears. Clara didn't beam. She didn't bow. But her eyes were bright, brighter than ever before. She had stood up, not to be perfect, but to be real. And for the first time in her life, her voice didn't disappear into silence. That morning, Clara arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. Not because there was too much to do. She simply didn't know how to move through the world with this new feeling. Recognition, pinned to the staff bulletin board behind the counter, was a printed notice in bold announcement. Clara officially appointed as cafe manager. She stared at the words as if they belonged to someone else. She didn't know what to feel, joy, fear, or just plain disbelief. When she stepped into the bar station, her co-workers clapped. Amy brought in a tray of cinnamon rolls, a tiny candle flickering in the center. "Not a birthday," Amy grinned, "but it is the first time this cafe has had a manager who cried during a presentation." Clara blushed but didn't lower her head. She thanked each of them, hands trembling slightly as she cut the pastry. It all felt like a dream, but this time she didn't want to wake up. Customers arrived earlier than usual. An elderly woman gave Clara a box of tea. A college student handed her a small handwritten card. "Thank you for keeping this place alive." Every word, every glance felt like a small stone laid on the foundation Clara had once feared she was too weak to hold. But now, stone by stone, it felt solid beneath her. By afternoon, sunlight spilled gold through the windows. Clara was reviewing the books when Lucas walked in, quiet as always, without announcement. He wore a light jacket, his hair tousled by the wind, but his eyes were softer than usual. "Take a walk with me," he said, hands in his pockets. Clara nodded, untied her apron, and followed him onto the front porch of the cafe. They stood by the wooden railing, watching people drift past on the street. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of warm pastries and freshly brewed coffee. Lucas leaned back against the railing, head tilted toward her. "Clara," he said. His voice didn't sound like it did in meetings. It sounded like someone who had finally set something heavy down. "I know you think I came here for profit." She glanced at him but didn't deny it. "And you'd be right," he went on. "At first, but after that first morning, I realized I wasn't here to calculate anything. I was here because I needed a new reason to believe in people." Clara said nothing, her eyes following the sunlight stretching across the wooden floorboards. "I didn't invest in numbers," Lucas said more slowly now. "I invested in you." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't romantic, and it didn't need a soundtrack. But it rang through Clara like the first sound after a long silence. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She simply looked at him for a long moment and then smiled. For the first time, the smile wasn't hidden, wasn't cautious, wasn't turned downward. It was the smile of someone who once believed she was only the shadow behind the counter, now realizing that light can come from the quietest place. And Lucas, seeing that light, didn't need any other reason to stay. Late summer. The wind still carried a hint of warmth, but the evening light had already begun to whisper of fall. Clara stood inside the cafe, smoothing the tablecloth for the third time. Outside, the golden string lights hung like threads of memory stretched across time. She didn't know why her hands were trembling, whether it was nerves or because tonight marked the end of something, the final music night of the summer. Of a program she once hadn't dared to believe would work, and maybe the close of a chapter in her life. The cafe had filled early. No invitations were needed. Everyone brought something: an old guitar, a jar of flowers, a book, a long-held hug. It didn't feel like a party. It felt like a reunion after a year apart. Clara moved slowly through the courtyard, each step retracing memories. That chair, where the old man once sat reading the paper. That table in the corner where a mother and daughter had laughed over a spilled cup of cocoa. And the center, where she had stood during the first music night, hands shaking, heart pounding. Lucas stood by the window, white shirt untucked, no tie, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He didn't approach. He just watched her for a long, quiet moment. Then, as though the lights themselves took a breath, the MC's voice rang out. Clara, who made this place a home for so many, would like to share a small something. Before we close. Clara stood still. She hadn't prepared anything. No speech. No plan. But she walked forward, not because anyone asked her to, but because her heart whispered, "It's time." She sat down at the piano. Her fingers rested gently on the keys. It was a wordless piece she had once played on a quiet afternoon, filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of her mother's fading breath. But tonight, it wasn't for comfort. It was to share. The music began. Each note fell like late sunlight, unhurried, undramatic, seeping gently into the quiet cracks people kept hidden. The room stilled. A child stopped chewing her cookie. A man closed his book. A woman let tears fall without knowing why. Lucas stepped forward. He didn't push through the crowd and didn't speak, just stood behind her. One hand rested lightly on her shoulder, the shoulder of someone who had carried too much for too long without realizing she was tired. Clara didn't look up, but her face glowed like a candle, eyes blurred not with weakness, but with the simple truth of finally feeling without hiding. When the song ended, there was no applause, just silence, the kind that feels holy. Lucas leaned down and whispered, "Stay." One word. Enough. Clara turned to him. Not quickly. Not with surprise. As if she had always known it would come. As if she had been waiting for it her whole life. She looked into his eyes. Didn't look away, didn't lower her gaze. She was fully there, present, brave, and at peace. And then she answered, "I already am. Even before you asked." There. Eyes met, not to confirm, but to remember. We stay not because someone holds us, we stay because we've found where we belong. There was no embrace. No kiss. Just Clara at the piano, Lucas beside her, and the golden light casting their faces in soft, steady glow, like two quiet stars finding each other in a galaxy without words. Thank you for staying until the end of this story, and if there's ever a moment when you feel too small for the rush of this world, remember, sometimes a single whisper is all it takes to change the course of someone's life. If this story touched something in your heart, leave a like or a follow, not just for me, but so that moments like this, soft and luminous, can find their way to someone else, because maybe you are the reason someone still believes in the kindness of tomorrow.